don't talk about it often, but Star Fox has always been very near and dear to me. That being said, I've also kind of had a rocky relationship with the series, as most others have also seemed to. I love Star Fox as a brand. I love the characters, I love the story, I love the whole aesthetic, but Nintendo, for whatever reason, constantly has tried to change what Star Fox is as a game. Most people agree Star Fox 64 was great, and a good improvement over its predecessor, which in hindsight basically served as a prototype for the series. After that, though, the whole situation kind of went off the rails. Nintendo started taking all sorts of chances with the IP and messing with the formula, when at the end of the day, I think most fans just wanted a regular Star Fox game. Because of this, despite loving the series as an idea, I honestly haven't played many of them. Don't get me wrong, there's a few entries I love, and we'll get to them along the way, but I have mostly steered clear of, well, the majority of Star Fox games. And so I decided I'm gonna give the entire series a fair shake. Maybe I'm preemptively judging these games that I might end up liking, who knows? We're gonna find out though. Today, I'm gonna take a look at every game in the Star Fox series. But first, I think you know what time it is. Time for you to get a watch.
This video brought to you by Holzkern. Holzkern, a name that literally means wood core in German, is an Austrian company that designs unique watches and jewelry from all natural materials. I've actually had my eye on their products for a long time now, so when the offer fell on my lap to partner up with them, it was a no-brainer. Holzkern has over 1,000 different unique products for both men and women, and due to the very nature of the materials they use, the various grains allow each piece to be truly one of a kind. I really love the Lucan model, which I picked out, which combines both maple and marble to create a classy jet black look, which in my opinion is very sleek looking. But if you're more of the peacocking type, they also have you covered with some flashier pieces as well. Their wood is also FSC certified, so no concerns with deforestation. Holzkern offers free express worldwide shipping from Vienna, and customs fees are also covered by them. Products arrive in 2 to 5 business days, and they offer a 24-month warranty on all watches, bandlets, and jewelry. So if you're as impressed by these designs as I was, maybe pick up one of Holzkern's one-of-a-kind watches or jewelry by clicking my link in the description or scanning my QR code and using coupon code GILLY for 10% off your order. And thanks again to Holzkern for sponsoring the video. Alright, so, as usual, pretty straightforward setup here. I'm gonna take a look at every game in the series in order of release. The Star Fox series is pretty easy to understand in that regard, with no real spin-offs or limited releases or anything weird like that, so this one should be pretty smooth sailing. That being said, I'm gonna talk about games in the Star Fox video game series. I'm not gonna be looking at the Star Fox content in Starlink, and I'm also not gonna track down one of those LCD watch games from like 1994. Consider that my coverage. That was me talking about them. Anyway, with all that being said, let's take a look at these. The original Star Fox for the SNES is one I don't have many first-hand memories of, at least when it comes to actually playing it. It came out back in 1993, so while I was alive for it, I was really young and I had only just started getting into games pretty recently. I do remember seeing ads and promotional stuff for it when I would go with my parents to Blockbuster, but at the time I was still on the NES. I wouldn't actually get to play a game in the series until its follow-up came out, and to this day, well, up until now, I never actually really played the original Star Fox. I did mess around here and there over the years, playing maybe a stage or two. Even back when I was little, I remember I did at least play the first stage in the game, but other than that, I really don't have many memories of it at all. All I can really remember is that it felt very, very, very slow, which is probably the reason I never went back and actually played through it. Now, part of the reason I do these videos is to remedy this exact situation, so I finally sat down and played through the first Star Fox. Most people know at this point that this game is the one that's been rebooted and remade 1,000 times over. Now, I know I'm getting ahead of myself, but at the very least, this game is a testament to how solid of a foundation this game really had, since they always end up circling right back to it. So, as I'm sure I don't really need to explain, it's an on-rail shooter. Your main objective is to blast your way through each stage to make your way to a planet called Venom to defeat the series' antagonist, Andross. Getting there, however, can happen in one of 3 ways. See, instead of a regular difficulty selection, Star Fox's stages are set up as different routes that can be taken, easy, normal, and hard, respectively. That being said, though, all of these stages are unique, so the game isn't really meant to be played in one straight shot and then have you call it a day. Each path features its own unique stages, each with an increase in difficulty. Along with you for the journey are the other 3 Star Fox pilots, Peppy, Slippy, and Falco. Peppy is the old veteran, Slippy is the liability, and Falco is the asshole. Now, in concept, they fight alongside you as you make your way through the various stages, but in practice, They don't really do anything to help you and mainly only serve as asses you gotta save when they find themselves in trouble, which you'll want to do because keeping them alive earns you a better score, which you'll need if you want to collect extra continues, which you'll probably need by the end of the game because this isn't exactly a cakewalk, and if you run out of lives, it's right back to the beginning of the game. Now, everything is pretty straightforward for the most part here. You fly through each stage, taking out enemies, and then fight a boss at the end of each stage, which consists of a big enemy with glowing targets you'll need to hit. The flying, for the most part, does feel relatively smooth despite how archaic these graphics are at this point. You can also use the shoulder buttons to tilt the R-wing and double tap to do a barrel roll to avoid incoming attacks, although this mechanic seemed kind of hit or miss to me. Literally. If you take too much damage, your ship will go down, but you can find various repair pickups and power-ups along the way which can refill your shield meter, increase your firepower, and also rebuild your ship's wings if they happen to get smashed off. There's also these limited-use bombs which can annihilate enemies on screen in one fell swoop, but they're a super limited resource, so be careful when you decide to use them. Now, mechanically, most of this game does work, and it's incredibly impressive for the time, but there are a few quirks that kind of bother me. For one, in this first entry, a regular third-person ship view lacks a reticle. This became commonplace after the first game, but this first go-around, no reticle, which makes it kind of hard to aim sometimes, especially considering just how geometrical and lacking textures this game is. You can go into a cockpit view to aim better, but this not only makes it so you have a harder time maneuvering your ship, but overall, I never really liked cockpit view in general because it takes away some of the personality of the experience. That probably sounds ridiculous, but for some reason, when I'm in cockpit view, I feel less immersed in the game. I don't know. Other than that, though, the game does work, and if you like Star Fox, the first game does have all the DNA of a proper Star Fox game. But with that being said, I never want to play this again in my life. Don't get me wrong, it's not badly designed or anything, but it's simply a drawback of what this game is. I've mentioned it a few times here and there, but sometimes I get pretty bad motion sickness, and it's kind of a roll of the dice what will and won't set me off, and unfortunately, this game makes me feel like I'm gonna vomit. This is mainly due to the frame rate, which is the crux of pretty much my entire problem with this game. It's incredibly ambitious, sure, but because of that, this game runs like a f***ing PowerPoint presentation. I can sit here and count the frames with my bare eyes as I play. It's rough. It's real rough. Mechanically, this works. Even controlling the R-Wing with a D-pad doesn't feel too bad, but the frame rate is too much for me to handle, man. Even in the best conditions, it's rough. And when, God forbid, there's a lot happening on the screen, the frames screech to almost a halt sometimes. If you've never experienced the first game in the series, of course, I think you should check this out, especially since it's easily available on NSO, but it's probably something you won't want to play more than once. It absolutely stands as a piece of history that should be respected, but it also has been done since and been done much better. So now we gotta make our way to the N64. Now, originally, we would have had one more stop on the SNES, but fate had other plans. That's a whole can of worms I'm sure most of you are probably aware of by now, but we'll get to that in due time. Instead of releasing a direct follow-up to the first Star Fox game, Nintendo made a bold decision to instead reboot the series on their new 3D console. This decision to reboot the first game would later become a source of contention for a lot of people, but at the time, this first attempt at rebooting Star Fox knocked it right out of the park and created pretty much the definitive Star Fox game. It took what the first game did, story beats and all, and fleshed it out into something which in my opinion is much, much more enjoyable. The original Star Fox is by no means a bad game, but it absolutely is held back by the hardware it was developed for. Star Fox 64 adds not only a more fleshed out story, but full voice acting, which, if you know anything about the N64, is few and far between. And it would be one thing to just have a couple lines here and there, but the entire prologue is narrated and there's tons of dialogue strewn throughout the entire game. It doesn't even sound that bad either. Not the most clear thing I've ever heard in my life, but it's absolutely not bit crushed to shit. So the controls this time around are much more fluid. It controls similarly functionally to the first game, but the R-Wing feels light years better to control, and a lock-on charge shot was also added. Apart from that, the R-Wing functions mostly the same, save for the somersault and U-turn, which come into play in all-range mode. All-range mode being a separate mode for certain levels in boss battles where instead of following an on-rails path, you can fly freely in an arena. Also new to this game are the Landmaster and Blue Marine, two crafts used for specific stages, both ground and water respectively. These don't see a whole lot of use, and you'll mainly be using the R-Wing for like 95% of the game, but it is a decent change of pace. That being said though, they really aren't all that fun to control, especially the Landmaster. I'm kind of mixed on their inclusion. On one hand, they mix up the gameplay a bit and keep it just a little fresher with a switch up to the gameplay, but overall, They really aren't more fun or even comparably as fun to use. Now, the difficulty this time around operates similarly to the first game, but with a twist. Instead of selecting which path to take from the start, it's more of an active difficulty situation. See, there's certain stage objectives you need to meet in each stage to fully complete it. Getting to the end of each stage and beating it pushes you on to the next. But only by getting the mission accomplished screen can you take the upper path and get the true and most complete ending. You can totally play through the game and ignore all this, but the game will force you to take the lower path. Similarly, if you're on the upper path and f*** up like I did, it'll kick you down to a lower one. These objectives range from taking out a certain amount of enemies, or keeping a certain teammate safe, or hitting specific targets during a stage, so on and so forth. And I'd say it's definitely worth going after, because the true ending is a lot more satisfying in my opinion. Oh, and also this time around, your teammates are actually useful. Each of them has their own respective ways that they can help you in each stage, so there's more reason to keep them alive than before. The inclusion of voice acting also does kind of personify them a little better, and their company, in my opinion, does add to the experience of the game. When they're all knocked out, the game is noticeably emptier and lonelier. Speaking of your teammates, the more fleshed out story gives a little more insight here. The current incarnation of the Star Fox team is actually Star Fox 2.0. The original team was made up of Peppy, a character named Pigma, and Fox's dad, James McCloud. When trying to take down Andross, Pigma betrayed his team and James McCloud f***ing dies. Peppy manages to escape, and after informing Fox of his dad's demise, Fox reboots the Star Fox team with new recruits. Pigma ends up being still a big part of this game though, because probably one of the most memorable parts of this game is the dogfights between Star Fox and a rival mercenary team called Star Wolf, led by Wolf O'Donnell. Similarly to Star Fox being recruited by General Pepper and the Cornerian Army, Star Wolf is hired by Andross. On that very team, alongside Wolf, is none other than Pigma. Now, the story isn't the deepest, but when compared to the first game, at least what's explained in-game, there's a lot more going on here, and it's just a much more enjoyable experience even when looking at the story. That being said, like I mentioned, you won't necessarily see all this story your first go-through, but this game is meant to be played over and over, not a one-and-done kind of deal. It's absolutely an arcade-style game, which is only further supported by the fact that there's an arcade-style high-score system where you put your initials in at the end. A single run of Star Fox 64 will take you around an hour, but if you want to see everything, you'll need to play it at least a few times over. And even after that, there's reasons to keep playing and trying to get the highest score or earn the gold medals for each stage. Keep this whole arcade-style game thing in the back of your mind, by the way, because this will come up later in the video. Star Fox 64 is a lot of, if not most people's favorite Star Fox game, and for good reason. They even remade the game for the 3DS. I would say that's the definitive way to play the game, if not for the fact that it's unfortunately stuck on a handheld. If that's not a deal breaker for you, by all means play the 3DS version. It's definitely prettier and more fine-tuned. But for me though, due to the fact that it is stuck on a handheld, while admittedly being the better version of the game, it can't really replace the console version for me, which is also how I feel about both N64 Zelda games that were remade for the 3DS. God, I wish they'd port these. Hey, real quick, if you're liking the video and want to see more from me, consider subscribing. It really does help out, like a lot, when the algorithm decides it doesn't want to be kind. So if you want to see future uploads, maybe tap that subscribe button. That's all I gotta say. So from the beginning, I knew this section of the video was going to be the most loaded one and also the most contentious. It's a tale as old as time by now. Star Fox Adventures for the Nintendo GameCube was never supposed to be a Star Fox game to begin with. I hardly need to explain this story, as it's been covered more times than it's even possible to count, and by people much more qualified than I. But to summarize, in its inception, Star Fox Adventures was a game being developed by Rareware for the N64, entitled Dinosaur Planet. It was a good deal into development when Rare ended up in talks with Nintendo to rework the title after showing the game to them. From what I've heard, this idea was pitched by Miyamoto, apparently, I think, but considering the main protagonist looked strikingly similar to Fox McCloud, Nintendo offered to partner up with Rare to marry the game with their IP. Now, obviously, this wasn't Rare's initial vision for the game, so I'm sure a lot of compromises needed to be made, but from a business perspective, it does make sense why they'd take the offer. Proven successful first-party Nintendo IP versus new, untested third-party IP. Clearly, one is going to do better numbers. And so the game was reworked into a Star Fox game, and one of the main protagonists of Dinosaur Planet, Crystal, ended up being pushed over as a side character to make room for Fox, who replaced an original character named Saber. Not only that, development was then shifted from the N64 to the GameCube, so this game went through quite a few iterations before becoming what it ultimately became. Now, at the time this game came out, I'll be honest, it was pretty confusing. I feel like people maybe forget this, but Star Fox Adventures is the third game in the series. A series which started off with 2 games of which one was a reboot. So while yes, in the grand scheme of things, the genre switch up makes no sense, at the time, it's not like that much of a precedent was set in the first place. Kind of like in situations like Zelda 2 or Castlevania 2. Anyway, Star Fox Adventures ended up being, well, an adventure game. Many people refer to it as a Zelda clone, and I can definitely see that. I don't necessarily disagree with that either, but I'd say it's different enough from Zelda that I wouldn't exactly call it a carbon copy. The game does have some watered-down traditional Star Fox R-Wing sections. They're also used to travel to some of the different areas in the game, but these are few and far between and mainly only serve as a means to go, hey, look, we didn't forget this is Star Fox. The main meat of the game consists of you playing as Fox, going on a heap load of fetch quests to defeat the game's antagonist, General Scales. You can definitely tell the story was not rooted in Star Fox lore and that it was all tacked on because the whole vibe in general doesn't seem consistent with Star Fox. I'd say one of the major differences between this and Zelda is the combat. You see, Star Fox Adventure's combat is unique in that it's not good. Granted, Zelda doesn't always have the most engaging combat, but even the most basic Zelda combat is still okay. This is just not fun. You pretty much just need to wait for openings and button mash, and the feedback you get when your attacks connect are also pretty unsatisfying. Your main weapon, a staff that belongs to Crystal, not only functions as your main weapon, but also your means to learn new abilities. Much like the Metroidvania nature of Zelda progression, the staff functions in much the same way. These abilities range from a fire blast to an ice blast to a ground pound, a vertical boost, and so on. Another main mechanic to this game is the sidekick/partner character, a little dinosaur named Tricky that helps you find items, open up blocked paths, and there's a lot of context-sensitive actions to help you progress in the game. Every time you use one of his abilities, though, he uses up some of his energy, and you need to replenish it by feeding him mushrooms you find throughout the various areas of the game. Now, much like Zelda, Star Fox Adventures has a good amount of dungeons and puzzles, but they're all relatively basic. Zelda isn't always the most difficult series in the world, but Star Fox Adventures puzzles are even more simplified. The game is pretty much like a very diluted, dumbed-down Zelda. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say this is a horrible thing, and Lord knows if I actually played the game when I was a kid, I probably would have enjoyed it quite a bit, but as an adult, it just leaves a lot to be desired. In all honesty, it really doesn't do anything genuinely bad, so I won't say Star Fox Adventures is a bad game. Like many others have said, it is a bad Star Fox game, but as a game, no, it's not bad. It's just mid. The most mid anything could possibly be. And it's also very, very slow. That's probably the most frustrating part about it, in my opinion. Not only the movement itself, but the pacing in general is extremely slow. I swear to God, I didn't get to the first real dungeon till like 7 hours into the game. After that, it started to pick up, but it takes so long to get to any real action in this game. Although I will say, I can't complain about how this game looks, though. It's honestly stunning for the GameCube, and its water effect rivals that of Mario Sunshine, which to this day is still probably my favorite look for water and reflections, so that says a lot. By today's standards, it's nothing jaw-dropping, but it's extremely impressive for the GameCube. Oh, and I guess I should mention, a few years back, an original N64 ROM for a build of Dinosaur Planet leaked online. From what I've heard, it does have a lot of issues with crashing on original hardware, but a lot of pieces are there, and apparently people have been working to make it more playable. I haven't tried it myself, but if that interests you at all, it's definitely something to look into. The build was apparently after Saber had already partially been replaced by a model of Fox, but supposedly there's still some Saber DNA in there, so it's something to check out if you're curious. That's about all I really need to say about Star Fox Adventures. Obviously, there's a lot to this game, and if I sat here and did a full review of it in its entirety, I'd have a lot more to say, but as it stands, it's pretty much just Zelda Light with a Star Fox skin. It's not a bad game, it's not a great game. It's definitely kind of charming, and it's really just a very strange piece of Star Fox, Nintendo, and Rareware history. Oh, and don't bother haggling with the shopkeep, it only saves you like $1. So after the massive departure that was Star Fox Adventures, a sort of return to form would also appear on the GameCube, this time with Namco at the helm. I say sort of return to form because while the R-Wing gameplay is back, this time it's shared with other types of gameplay, and shared way more than it should be. So this time around, instead of having a big map with different routes to take, Star Fox Assault is a straight shot story mode made up of 10 missions. You can select the difficulty, but this time the difficulty isn't broken up into different campaign paths. The gang's all here again, but this time Peppy takes a back seat and is no longer an active pilot, instead being replaced by Crystal, who was introduced in Star Fox Adventures. It's honestly kind of weird how Star Fox Adventures was never supposed to be a Star Fox game in the first place, and Crystal was supposed to be a character completely separate from the Star Fox universe, and now she's just one of the bros. It's weird how stuff like that happens sometimes. Like how much of the Mario series identity and enemies come directly from Super Mario Bros. 2, which famously wasn't originally a Mario game, but I digress. So, Star Fox Assault throws you right into the action with an R-Wing stage. And at first, you're like, yes! Classic Star Fox gameplay, baby! We're back in action! This is a false sense of security, though, because it won't be long before you realize that the majority of this game's gameplay is in fact not made up of flying sections and not even of Landmaster sections, but rather Fox McCloud on foot with tank control sections. And the R-Wing sections that do exist aren't even mostly comprised of the linear on-rails gameplay, but rather all range mode sections, which in my opinion, despite being less restricting, have always been more cumbersome than the on-rail sections. So 99% of this game is actually comprised of you running around open stages, taking out a number of target enemies. Each stage has its own objective, but the majority of what you're going to be doing is running around, tracking down specific targets with your radar to take out X number of targets, and doing so completes the mission, for the most part. There's some variation here where sometimes the mission gets updated and you have extra objectives, but this is pretty much what most of the game is comprised of, or at least that's sure as hell what it feels like. There are some instances where you can hop into a Landmaster or an R-Wing in some of these stages, but many of the targets are located inside buildings or structures that you can only enter as Fox on foot, so there's really no getting around it. I also don't know what possessed them to give Fox tank controls, but here we are. It's mostly okay, but I'd be lying if it didn't get annoying anytime I needed to swiftly change direction. There's also a couple stages where you, instead of piloting a ship, play as Fox standing on the wing of someone else's ship, firing shots at enemies in on-rail sections. These are more enjoyable than the on-foot stages, I'll admit, but they're still a far cry from standard R-Wing gameplay, and judging by said R-Wing gameplay, this game could have knocked it out of the park. Genuinely. The flying sections are fun. It controls well, the game looks great, the story is engaging, which I don't want to spoil, but the stuff that I loved about it I need to spoil to explain, so I won't get into that. The banter between characters is also charming, even more so this time in my opinion, but they mucked up the whole thing by including way too much gameplay that deviates from the thing that made Star Fox a beloved game in the first place, and it honestly drives me up a wall. This isn't the first, nor is it the last time this has happened, and we'll get more into that going forward, but this is the first time they tried to make a traditional Star Fox game after 64. I'll give Adventures a pass. I always did. It was never supposed to be anything other than what it was. It's very much its own thing and only exists because it was already being worked on as a separate project. But when it came to make another proper Star Fox game, they did whatever this shit is. It's such a shame because the gameplay I want out of this series is there, but unfortunately it's few and far between, and the game is so short that you never really get a chance to appreciate it. Look, I have no problems with Star Fox switching up the formula and throwing in a couple different types of gameplay, but the focus should be on Rails R-Wing gameplay, or at the very least just R-Wing gameplay. But once again, we have a game that doesn't understand why people loved Star Fox in the first place. Outside of the fact that the direction they took isn't what people really wanted, I think Namco otherwise did a great job here. Like, what's here isn't bad, but unfortunately a lot of what's here isn't fun. It's pretty much just going through the motions waiting to get to an R-Wing section, which they've proved they can put together quite well. There's a decent amount of boss encounters in the R-Wing, and while they don't really reach the highs of what was on offer in Star Fox 64, are still fun enough that if an entire game was based around it, it could have easily been an amazing Star Fox game. Unfortunately, though, that's not what happened, and instead, Star Fox Assault just kinda turned into a disappointment that likes to occasionally tease you with what you probably really want. Look, like I said, I'm not going to say Star Fox Assault is bad. It isn't, and Lord knows a lot of people do happen to love it, but much like a lot of this series, the general consensus is that this was another letdown, and I'm inclined to agree. I'd say it's worth playing. It's not one I'd skip, and it's short enough, but it's definitely not worth a revisit, in my opinion. And so we make our way to the DS, and the first Star Fox game released for a handheld instead of Nintendo's current home console at the time. Now, this game was released just a few months prior to the release of the Wii, but you'd think a Star Fox game on the Wii would have been a no-brainer. I really never put that much thought into it before, but despite how averse I am to motion control, Star Fox on Wii would have made complete sense. Instead, though, we got Star Fox Command on the DS, which, funny enough, is a game that probably would have worked 100 times better had it been on the Wii instead. See, Star Fox Command utilizes the dual screens in a unique way, and that unique way is relegating all of the DS's buttons to shoot and instead making it entirely controlled via the touchscreen. I'll get to how I feel about that and how it functions in practice in a little bit, but first let's go over how this game is set up, as it's extremely different from anything that's come before it. So instead of having a level select screen with a regular series of levels to play through, each stage of the game is separated into two sections. One is at least a version of the type of gameplay we've come to expect, an all-range mode R-Wing section, but these are broken up by what I can only describe as a tactical minigame. Each stage sees you navigating a sort of overworld map with X amount of enemies on screen as well as mothership bases. You get a limited number of turns to move before it's game over, and with every turn, enemies move closer and closer, making their way to the Great Fox. If they reach the Great Fox without you intervening, it's game over. All these enemies need to be destroyed to progress to the next stage, and each cluster of enemies basically acts as its own R-Wing stage. Intercept a fleet of enemies, and then you enter any number of stages where you need to take out a certain number of enemies before running out of time. There's also other fights you end up in along the way, like run-ins with Starwolf and Andrew Oikony, who at this point, and I forgot to mention this in the Star Fox Assault section, is just referred to as Oikony, which kinda struck me as odd. He made his debut in Star Fox 64 and was called Andrew in that game, and then once he came back, they just started calling him Oikony like no one would notice. It's like Dunkin' Donuts just randomly changing its name to Dunkin' and pretending like that's just what it's always been called. Anyway, along the way, you'll re-recruit many of the legacy Star Fox team members as well as newcomers, as this game starts off telling us that Star Fox has since disbanded. You start the game as a lone Fox McCloud, but as the game progresses, the band gets back together and then some. Each new pilot added to your team also become playable characters, each with their own unique R-Wing abilities, so it's more than just a cosmetic thing. That all being said, I honestly find the game to be pretty monotonous. I also find it to be a few more things than that, but I'll bite my tongue for just a little bit longer. I already don't like these tactical sections, and honestly, they're pretty frustrating and clumsy in my opinion. Not to mention, you can make a wrong move and that totally gates you out of succeeding, and the game still will throw you into an R-Wing section only to see you immediately game over afterwards, so that in and of itself is annoying. But when it comes to the R-Wing sections themselves, even if I had no problem with the controls, still biting my tongue here, they are at best monotonous and really just boil down to fly around and shoot X amount of enemies with little to no variety, except for stuff like the dogfights with Starwolf or boss fights. That all being said, even if this game had the most perfectly crafted stages and the most fun and engaging tactical sections, it would not at all even matter anyway, because the controls are a hot sack of dog shit. Gloves are off now. I don't think I've ever had a more displeasing and grueling experience with a video game. Controlling this game with the touchscreen is cumbersome, frustrating, and cramps the shit out of my hand, and it doesn't help that you need to fire with your left hand, which feels completely unnatural and gross, and the game expects you to fly and shoot with precision that it really doesn't give you the tools to handle. Sure, it's all doable. The game does work, but it's frustrating and not fun, and the timer only serves to make it worse. You really aren't given enough time to complete the tasks it asks of you considering how clumsy the controls are, and the game must know this because it throws in time bonuses littered throughout each stage, but you need to constantly micromanage your time by actively ignoring the goal to make sure you pick up time bonuses. The dogfighting is also at its absolute worst here since your enemy ships just fly all over the place all willy-nilly, and despite you having your normal options like the U-turn, somersault, and barrel roll, the enemies aren't using touch controls and can move much more quickly and gracefully than you can, so situations like the dogfights especially honestly feel like running around your house trying to kill a fly with your bare hands. This shit sucks. And you know what the funniest part about all this is? They, for whatever reason, made the game exclusively all-range gameplay. Had this been, once again, I can't believe they don't get this, but once again, if these were just straightforward on-rail stages, the touchscreen gimmick would have worked so much better. I still wouldn't have liked needing to use the touchscreen to control the R-Wing, but you'd be knocking out so many variables by setting the R-Wing on a set path. You'd only be responsible for moving the ship in 2 axes, which, in my opinion, is where Star Fox gameplay shines the brightest and is the most graceful anyway. This whole thing really could have just been avoided if they forewent the touchscreen and just let you use the D-pad for normal-ass controls, or at least gave you the option, but even then, the game still would have been pretty bland, though it would have at least not made me want to rip my hair out. I hated this. I really hated this. I hated this so much more than I ever thought I would or could. But hey, luckily, if you want to experience every ending, you also have to play it 400 times just to see the grossest Ken Penders ass renditions of the Star Fox cast I've ever seen in my life. So you got that to look forward to, at least. We've made it to probably the most divisive one of the bunch, and the one I was looking forward the most to revisiting. This may be a shock to some people, especially those of you who are new, but I f***ing love Star Fox Zero. I don't want to get ahead of myself though, so let me touch more on that in a minute. So after countless years without a Star Fox game, apart from the Star Fox 64 remake for the 3DS, we finally got news of a new Star Fox game being developed in part by none other than Platinum Games. Not something I think anybody really saw coming or even considered, but it seems to make perfect sense with the spectacle nature of Platinum's work. No doubt this came off the heels of Platinum working directly with Nintendo to get Bayonetta 2 out the door. Platinum would co-develop Star Fox Zero alongside Nintendo. However, that hype didn't last long and quickly turned into worry once Nintendo started boasting about how the game was actually designed. As it turns out, instead of being a straightforward Star Fox game like everyone had wanted, of course, Nintendo had to get all unique just for the sake of it and heavily utilize the Wii U's gamepad in a way which to them seems innovative, immersive, and clever, but to everyone at home seemed like a f***ing nightmare. People also would start to criticize how the game looks, with claims of it having pretty low fidelity overall. Suffice it to say, people were more than a little concerned. Well, the game finally released, and oh boy, did shit hit the fan. Released alongside a second side game called Star Fox Guard, which was packed in with the physical release, we'll get to that one in a little bit, Star Fox Zero was met with what's the opposite of praise? Anger and vitriol. The game also turned out to be yet another reboot of the series, once again retelling the events which originally took place in the first Star Fox game for the SNES, and to make matters worse, after the release of Star Fox 64 3D, this would basically be the 4th time this story was repackaged. People were not happy. Above all else, though, the biggest complaint about the game was that of the control scheme, which, according to those who criticized it, is game-breakingly cumbersome and forced you to constantly bounce your eyes back and forth between the TV screen and gamepad. That all being said, this is not the experience I had. I, along with a few other people I know who to this day are willing to die on Star Fox Zero's hill, I love the game to death. And after replaying it for this video, yeah, this game still rules, dude. Look, it has its issues, I won't deny that, but it's the most fun I've had with a Star Fox game since 64, and while I don't think it quite reaches the highs of 64 for me, it's definitely up there and does feel like its own game, not like a lesser 64, and it also does plenty of unique things that, while I'll admit I don't necessarily prefer over straight-up R-Wing gameplay, still are generally pretty fun. So the game is set up similarly to 64. Bunch of branching paths to different stages with different paths being taken depending on what you do in each stage. Now, for the most part, this game has more straight-up R-Wing gameplay than anything since 64. And the parts that aren't are still R-Wing adjacent, like the Walker, for example, a new addition to this game, and an idea that was taken from a canceled game, which we'll get to later. See, as much as I like to think R-Wing trumps all other forms of Star Fox gameplay, things like the Walker sure beat the hell out of tank-controlling Fox McCloud running around an arena on foot. As different as this game tries to be in terms of how it functions, it's honestly very much back to Star Fox's arcadey basics. It's not a game that's meant to be played one time, which, funny enough, is another complaint people had, that it was too short. It's not too short. It's a game that's meant to be replayed multiple, if not an endless amount of times. And even when you've collected everything and taken every route and seen everything the game has to offer, it still is worth replaying for the sake of getting a higher score. That's how 64 was, and that's what Star Fox was when everybody loved it. A romp that lasts a couple hours, not a 60-plus hour open-world adventure. So in that regard, I believe it's exactly what it was supposed to be. Anyway, I guess I'll address the elephant in the room, the controls. And I've talked about this in the past, but I mean this with full conviction when I say I never and still do not understand what the problem is. Yes, the default intended control scheme is a mess. There's no denying that. The game really does want you to play it the way everyone hates. But it's also like 97% not even necessary. First of all, the motion controls. Star Fox Zero implements gyro aiming into the mix. Great for a game like Splatoon, not so great for a game like Star Fox where movement and aiming has always been tied to the same control. But the thing is, you can turn it off. There's an option right in the pause menu to toggle it off. Not entirely, mind you. The gyro still activates when you're actively shooting, but it's not in any kind of way that's a detriment to the controls. If anything, I think it helps out with being a little bit more precise. You can still aim with the thumbstick and then make fine adjustments with gyro. Would I prefer 100% traditional Star Fox controls? Sure, but toggling the motion controls to only while shooting makes this game 100 times easier to play. But what about cockpit view, you might be asking? See, Star Fox Zero has these mandatory instances where you're forced to look through a first-person view through the R-Wing's cockpit, and this is normally relegated to the gamepad screen, and therein lies the problem. Looking at the main screen, it's impossible to properly control the R-Wing, and you sometimes need to look through cockpit view, forcing you to bounce your eyes back and forth between the screens. Except, you literally don't need to do that. A feature I almost never hear anyone talk about is how the screens can be swapped by pressing the minus button. So anytime the game puts me in a position where I need to play in cockpit view, I just press the minus button and the screens immediately swap. I played through and beat Star Fox Zero without ever needing to so much as glance at the gamepad, except for the one time when I used it to turn off the motion controls everybody complains about. Like I said, is this perfect? Hell no, and I'll admit it's more cumbersome than I'd like, but it's by no means a game-breaking issue, and it really doesn't take away from the experience that much, at least for me. I would, of course, enjoy it more with traditional controls, but there are workarounds available, and I think the game does enough on its own to warrant looking past those blemishes. I think the game honestly looks gorgeous, the voice acting is fun, the story goes even a bit deeper than before, and I think this is the best told version of this story thus far, because let's face it, I'm sure Nintendo will end up rebooting Star Fox 1 again one day. Anyway, I love Star Fox Zero, and I wish more people would give it a second chance, especially with those little workarounds to the control scheme that I don't ever really hear anyone talk about. In my opinion, this is the most pure Star Fox game that's been made since 64, and replaying it again for the first time since it came out back in 2016, I still like it just as much as I did day one. As for the pack-in bonus game, Star Fox Guard, it's basically just a simple action tower defense game where you need to monitor a bunch of screens and keep enemies away. I would go more in depth, but honestly, what you see here is what you get. So in lieu of being unnecessarily verbose, it's basically the Five Nights at Slippy's. It's fun. There's a lot of stages, there's boss fights. It's very clear why this is a pack-in game and not a full release, but it's definitely worth checking out, and it was a fun little free inclusion with the main game that, for whatever reason, surprisingly got its own physical release instead of just being on Zero's disc or from a download code or something. So, Star Fox Zero and Guard would and should be where this series leaves off, as they were the last games in the series to be developed. That's not how the story goes, though, and I'm sure most of you knew this one was coming. If you're a fan of Star Fox in any capacity, you probably know about the canceled Star Fox 2 that was going to be released for the SNES. As the story goes, the game was essentially finished before it was canned just before release to instead shift focus to the N64. Instead of redeveloping the game for the N64, though, many of its ideas, mechanics, and concepts were instead repurposed, not only in Star Fox 64, but subsequently in Star Fox Command and even Zero. Star Fox 2 showed up over the years in a few different forms with leaked beta builds floating around the internet, and though they were in a playable state, enough to actually be enjoyed and played through, everyone knew it technically wasn't a finished product, and we didn't know if a completed version would ever see the light of day. It was known that a fully completed ROM did exist because one of the main developers of Star Fox Command was handed the ROM to help him develop Command, but it wasn't hopeful anyone would ever get their hands on it. That was until Nintendo threw a curveball and out of seemingly nowhere included Star Fox 2 as a featured game on the SNES Classic Edition. The game was finally officially released, and weirdly enough was done so on a limited edition mini console. What a very Nintendo thing to do. Luckily though, once Nintendo started making retro games playable via the NSO service, the game became way more available as anyone with a Switch could now play it. So in its current state, that's pretty much the most viable way to play this game in an official capacity. I had messed around with one of the older builds years ago, but didn't really understand what I was doing as it's not as straightforward as the first Star Fox game, and I didn't have the patience for it at the time. I finally played through it though, and I have to say, surprisingly, I actually really enjoyed this one. Don't get me wrong, it's flawed, very much so, but in my opinion, it's a pretty fun but extremely short time. So the setup is very different from Star Fox 1, or honestly really any other game in the series with the exception of maybe Command. See, instead of a set path of levels, each playthrough is randomized in terms of what stages you'll play. In one corner of the map is Corneria, and the other is where Andros is. Andros unleashes a full-scale attack on Corneria and also takes control of a set of random planets and sets up base on them. These bases fire off missiles that head towards Corneria and only stop once you take them out. Other hazards also head towards Corneria, and it's your job to both take out the enemy bases as well as protect Corneria from incoming attacks. This all happens in real time though, so you basically need to micromanage the whole situation. You may want to take out an enemy base, but now a missile or a giant laser ship is about to attack Corneria, so you need to divert your attention first to take care of it. Corneria can take some damage, but if the damage level reaches 100, it's game over. So you do have the option of letting Corneria eat some hits, but it's ultimately a risk and you need to figure out who needs your attention the most at any given time. The stages, instead of being on rails, mostly consist of arenas and all-range mode sections. Normally I don't love these, but in the case of Star Fox 2, it's so different that I think it kind of works. You need to navigate these areas, defeating enemies and flipping switches to ultimately destroy each enemy base with the help of the Walker by taking out certain target enemies or machinery, which, if you couldn't tell by now, was also introduced here first. The controls for the Walker are a bit more clunky than the R-Wing, but I still think it mostly works. There's also a cavalcade of brand new characters introduced in this game because, surprise, this is where Star Wolf originally came from, and you'll find yourself having your typical dogfight run-ins with them throughout each playthrough. Also new to this game are two brand new Star Fox team pilots, Miu and Faye. See, in Star Fox 2, there's also 6 playable characters to choose from, and for each run you pick 2 characters, a main pilot and a wingman, or backup character, and you can switch between them between stages with the select button. There's 6 characters broken up into 3 different classes. Fox and Falco are the all-rounders, Slippy and Peppy have way more defense at the expense of offensive capability, and Miu and Faye are glass cannons. Crazy how there were 2 original characters that never saw the light of day till now. They never even included them in any other Star Fox game despite using so much of this game's DNA in subsequent games. Anyway, if you can manage to keep Corneria alive and take out all of Andros' resources as well as any mini-bosses you may encounter, then you get to take him on, and his stage is a cool little miniature dungeon of sorts. It's a very, very short game, but that's definitely by design. Star Fox always worked best when its campaign was a short playthrough that was meant to be replayed, experimented with, and improved on. Star Fox 2 mixes it up even further by randomizing each playthrough, which, while it doesn't make it the most exciting thing in the universe, it at least switches things up enough so that every time you play, you get a slightly different experience. It's a shame this game was never released when it was first developed, but I'm glad they at least actually did end up releasing it, especially since it's a ROM that was never found prior. I honestly think this is a big improvement over the first game. It's a lot more creative, both functionally and artistically. It's much more exciting and pleasing to look at, and it even runs better too. I like this one. And that's all of them. So far anyway. This is the first time I hope a video becomes outdated sooner rather than later, because honestly, the fate of this series is completely uncertain at this point. Granted, Star Fox has received better treatment than F-Zero over the years, that's for sure, but after the whole Star Fox Zero situation, the sales numbers from that and the backlash that came in its wake, the fate of the Star Fox series is shaky at best. My only hope is that Nintendo realizes one day what people actually like about this series and stop trying to overcomplicate a game series that should be so simple. Make a good on-rail shooter. I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that's all anyone really wants. Now that I've gone and checked out all the games I avoided for so long, I gotta say, my opinion is pretty much right where it's always been. The original game should be respected for what it did, but apart from 64 and Zero, which I love, I can't say I particularly like any of these with the exception of Star Fox 2. Surprisingly, Star Fox Adventures started to get a bit better as I played, but that's kind of the odd one out for reasons we all know at this point. Other than that, I don't really have any desire to replay any of these besides 2 and the ones I already knew I liked, especially not Command. I don't think I've ever hated a game more in my life. I'm still a fan of this series because I know what it can be, and I hope one day Nintendo wakes up and realizes it too, because there's a really great IP buried beneath a lot of unnecessary garbage. And bring back Miu and Faye. That's all for this one, and thanks again to Holtzgren for sponsoring the video. Click my link in the description and use code GILLY for 10% off your order site-wide. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can check out. And if you want to see everything I upload, subscribe and then tap the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, I also have a Patreon right there too.